Welcome to Easy in the Harness, stories, solutions, and strategies for safe, satisfying driving. My name is Corey Trout, and I am your host. In this episode, we are going to discuss the training quadrants. I initially thought this was going to be a short explanation, but then I realized I actually had a lot to say about it. I want to start out saying that I use both positive and negative reinforcement in my training. What I end up using most of the time when I work with a particular animal depends on the desires of my clients as well as the individual personality of the animals I work with. Some do way better with a positive reinforcement method and others don't seem to care so much. For example, the miniature cow I worked with, Bess, she was not a treat animal. You couldn't give her a treat to save her life. So using food-based rewards was a no-go with her. She also didn't care a whole lot for physical pressure, so if you applied pressure, a lot of the time she would just kind of stand there and ignore you, which made her a very interesting training challenge. But that aside, it's basically going off of different animals having different personalities, and what works well with one might not work as well for another. So the 4 training quadrants fall under the operant conditioning umbrella in behavioral science. You have 2 positives, 2 negatives, 2 reinforcements, and 2 punishments. Reinforcement means that the technique reinforces a behavior. If you want to increase a behavior's occurrence, you use a reinforcement technique. If you want to stop something from happening, you use a punishment. Punishment, in theory, decreases the occurrence of a behavior. So in positive reinforcement, you add something, thus the positive, that the animal likes when they do the right thing to reinforce said behavior. Negative reinforcement takes away something to reinforce the behavior, thus the use of the word negative. So in classical driving technique, you use the whip on the left shoulder, the horse moves to the right, you stop using the whip. You pick up your right rein, which applies pressure to the right side of the horse's mouth, and when the horse looks to the right, you release pressure. That is negative reinforcement. You have something that is not so desirable, the horse does the thing, and you remove that not desirable thing. Positive reinforcement is adding to, and this gets into the depths of the woods a little bit. There's multiple ways that you can do it. You can capture and shape a behavior. If the horse spontaneously does something you like, you mark and reward that behavior. Standing still, for example, the horse stands still for 2 seconds, you mark to say good job, and the horse is possibly a little confused as to what exactly it did to deserve the treat, but over time you reinforce when the behavior occurs in order to solidify that behavior. Eventually you add in a signal, and this is the signal I'm giving when I want the behavior, and you reinforce when the behavior shows up in order to be able to produce the behavior in a predictable manner on cue. A lot of people will use a combination of these two. You would say, be walking along and ask the horse to stop. They don't stop. You apply pressure to the lead rope. They stop, and then you reward. You have a combination of the pressure goes away and the horse gets something cool, whether that's a scratch or treat or whatever. We do try to avoid the punishment side of the quadrants. Part of that is it focuses on the quote-unquote negative behaviors that we do not want, and a lot of times through the course of training, if you ignore the quote-unquote bad behaviors and focus on the quote-unquote good ones, the animal will discard the bad behavior because it is non-productive. It naturally extinguishes itself. That said, there are some situations in which you need to strongly discourage dangerous behavior. For example, if a horse whips its head around and tries to bite your arm, there will be a quick deflection of that behavior to discourage it from happening again. Not to say you would beat the horse about the head for 5 minutes, but if its nose runs into my elbow or whatever instead of grabbing a bite of my arm, I think all's fair in that situation. As an aside, knowing what triggered the strong negative behavior is important because kicking and biting can be signs that the animal's in pain or the handler has ignored other more subtle cues that what is going on is uncomfortable or beyond the animal's tolerance. Take these moments to reflect on what led up to a kick, bite, or other strongly negative behavior and figure out how to avoid it and also how to work the animal through its discomfort, fear, or distrust of what is being done to or asked of it. There is also negative punishment, and negative punishment is the opposite of positive reinforcement. So instead of giving something good to reinforce a behavior, you take away something it wants. So picture this scenario. You go out to go feed your animals, and it bangs on the fence or the feeder, and then you turn around and walk away. That is negative punishment. Your horse wants the food. You know the horse wants the food. It bangs on the fence because it's impatient for the food, and then instead of feeding it, you turn around and walk away. And while this doesn't exactly ease the horse's anxiety about getting breakfast, it is the best example I can think of that most horse owners will understand or have an experience with. So basically, that negative punishment means you take away something that the animal desires in order to discourage an unwanted behavior. So for the most part, we work within the reinforcement ends of the quadrants and not on the punishment end. If you're just punishing all the time and trying to extinguish the bad behaviors, it's really difficult to cultivate the good behaviors that you do want. So in negative reinforcement, which is what you see in classical, traditional, or regular horse training, this quote-unquote traditional horse training came out of military procedures with the cavalry and such, where you're trying to get a bunch of random people and random horses getting along with each other in a short amount of time before sending them out to battle. But that is a ramble for another time. Back to negative reinforcement. This is the style that most people with a background in horses will be familiar with. It works best when you have really good timing. Typically, people are going to be told that you release the pressure when your horse does what you want. If you want to turn right, you keep a hold of your right rein until your horse takes a step to the right. But I would actually one-up that and say that you actually want to release when your horse starts thinking about what you're asking it to do. And this is what allows you to be much softer and lighter with what you're asking your animal to do. And I say horse a lot, but it applies to donkeys, mules, oxen, whatever it is that you're training to drive, because I do want this podcast to be open to all aspects and animals in the driving context. I just usually say horse because it's in my brain, and horses are a more common driving animal and the ones I have most experience with. But back to the subject at hand, when you apply pressure, it's releasing upon the thought of what you want that tells the horse it is on the right track. If you do this, your horse is going to become much more responsive because they see that you recognize their attempt and you're connecting to their thoughts instead of just to their body. We can mechanically ask the horse's body to do stuff, but if we can get their brain engaged, it works so much better. Our goal working with our animals is to communicate, and communication is not about just moving somebody else's body in specific patterns. It's about getting your brains on the same wavelength so your ideas become their ideas become your ideas, and you can both work towards a common goal much easier. Going back to this idea of when you release with negative reinforcement, you would pick up your rein, and as soon as you feel the vaguest softening into the direction you want, you release off of that. You can always pick up the pressure and ask again if you didn't get enough, but the idea is that you're releasing a lot sooner than your old school driving instructor may have told you. That idea of just hold on to that line until they give you what you want only gets you so far, especially with animals that have a higher sense of self-worth and are easily offended by potentially unfair or insensitive handling. Animals that are trained this way, coming off of the thought of doing the requested action, are much more responsive and willing than ones that are just pulled around mechanically. That said, horses and such can be amazingly adaptable and can get along well enough with any type of training that is consistent and fair. But if you want to up your driving game, you want to be sure you're communicating off of this higher level of response and release, and not just mechanically waiting for your horse to take that step, but feeling for when you're thinking of that step and releasing off of that. This change in timing is the thing that will improve the majority of drivers and their animals the fastest. Releasing off of the suggestion is my recommendation. I also recommend not getting stuck in steady pressure, but that's also a discussion for another time because it's harder to ignore pulsing pressure versus steady pressure. Moving on to the positive reinforcement side, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about this because it isn't as common in equine training. Going into the weeds, so to speak. Positive reinforcement has a steeper learning curve to start than negative reinforcement, and that's why some people reject it outright as a viable training option. It's pretty easy to pick up a rein and wait for the horse to do the thing and drop it. It's more work up front to develop the communication with signaling, applying a reward, and all that. If you decide that positive reinforcement is a way you wish to work, you first have to decide what your marker or bridge signal is going to be. The marker or bridge signal is the animal's signal they have done the right thing. The marker means you're marking the behavior as the one you want, and eventually it comes to mean, in the end, that the animal has done the right thing. Whether that's a clicker, sound, or word you use, it all does the same thing in the end. I personally don't use a clicker because with driving, my hands are already thoroughly occupied, especially if I'm long lining an animal. I have my whip, I have my lines, and sometimes I have an emergency release in my hand. So there's only so much room. To make the bridge signal work for me, I use an auditory signal that is produced by my own body and doesn't involve my hands. Some people would argue that the clicker is there because it makes the same consistent sound every time so that the animal can rely on it never changing, and that is valuable and noteworthy. And if you want to use a clicker, use a clicker. Some people will make a click sound with their tongue, and I have gotten much better at being able to do that than I used to be, but it's still not quite a natural thing for me, and I haven't integrated into my training fully. So I just use the word yes. It's readily available. I do use it in normal conversation, which has the potential to cause confusion in some contexts, but it is the first thing I go for. If something good is going on, yes is going to be the first thing out of my mouth, and it's a lot easier than. So I personally use yes as my marker when using positive reinforcement to train. Obviously, when you're saying a word instead of a sound, the tonality can change, and some people would argue that makes it more confusing for the animal if you have yes, 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 yes. But it works well enough for what I'm doing with the animals I'm working with. As I said before, I'm not a strictly positive reinforcement person, and maybe I'm doing it wrong, but it seems to work well enough for me and what I'm doing. You have your marker, bridge signal, whatever it's going to be, and you use it. If you're consistent with it, your animal is going to figure it out. You could choose whatever word or sound you want, so long as it's consistent and it is going to work and you are going to use it. At the start, you will do what some people call, quote-unquote, charging or loading that signal. You use your bridge signal noise treat, bridge noise treat, and they basically understand this noise means that food is coming or food is here. I will also note something else that I do is that I only give treats when I make my bridge or marker signal. I will not feed by hand spontaneously without making the bridge noise, because what I want to do is I want to be sure that there is only ever food around the animal's mouth when the noise happens. If you have an especially greedy animal, it might take them longer to figure it out, but eventually over time they realize, oh, okay, that noise means there is food, and if there's no noise, there is no food. Even for my students, if they ask about giving a treat, I'll say, yeah, you can do that, but you need to say the word yes when you do it. To help reinforce that signal means there's food, and food doesn't randomly appear from people's fingers without that noise. It makes it safer because you don't have animals nosing around your fingers and sucking them into their mouths, because fingers feel like carrots, and if they smell like carrots too, the horse is going to explore that, right? Extending off of that, if you are going to be using food rewards with positive reinforcement, any treat giving needs to be coupled with your marker, and that way it helps to discourage the grabby, sneaky hunting behavior. Another tip when you're giving treats and rewards, you don't want the animal hunting for the treat. You want to basically shove it into their face and let them take it. I have two horses I refer to as having vacuum faces. Anything that gets close, they just suck in, and trying to give them something by hand, their whole mouth would open, the lips would go wide, and they just suck it in there. Thankfully, they've never actually gotten anybody's finger, but I could see what was coming. What helped with that was something I learned from another positive reinforcement trainer, is you just kind of shove it in there. What that forces them to do is, one, they don't have to hunt for the treat, so the reaching, seeking behavior doesn't even start. And two, if you kind of just push it up into their mouth, it takes them a second to realize, oh, it's there already. And they have to be more careful about how they acquire the food instead of turning into a vacuum and sucking everything into the abyss of their gullet. Other considerations, if you have a horse that is kind of a grabby face and trying to suck everything in, you don't reward that. You reward them being polite. If they're trying to rifle through your pockets, you either gently push them away or just move away, get behind a fence so they can't reach you, and when they're behaving themselves and being polite again, then you reward that behavior. So there is a little bit of negative punishment there because you're withholding as they try to rifle in your pockets. Also consider that you are using food rewards, so be sure your horse is not starving. Keep in mind that horses in particular have food in their stomachs for only about 30 minutes at a time, and then it empties out. So don't do a positive reinforcement session 10 minutes before evening feed time and they haven't had any hay for 4 hours. letting them eat a little bit while you groom up and what have you. And I generally would recommend this even if you're not using positive reinforcement for the aforementioned reason of their intestinal functions. Horses are much happier if they have a little something in their gut. It prevents ulcers, reduces stress, so on and so forth. Depending on the flavor of positive reinforcement you're doing depends on how this goes. But I basically use a combination of positive and negative reinforcement. I usually signal the horse what I want, and then when they move towards that direction, I use my marker to say, that's it, and then reward. I start out with a high rate of reward, and that means that every single time they do it, you're going to give them something for it. There are two main ways to reduce your reward frequency. One is to just drop off. So you ask the thing, click reward, click reward, click reward, click reward, click reward, click reward. The second way, and I think this one works a little bit better, you click reward, but also every once in a while you give them a bonus reward. Usually you give a little slice of carrot, or I actually use alfalfa pellets because 80 pounds of alfalfa pellets is much cheaper than a 2-pound bag of treats, and most horses appreciate them just as much. So instead of just a single pellet per click, every once in a while you give them 5. Say they gave you an extra good effort, it's like, yeah, that's awesome, here's extra. You become a little more like a slot machine than a treat dispenser. Sometimes you get 1 coin and sometimes you get 50. And it's like, yoo, that's great. So over time, you'll do click reward, click big reward, click reward, click reward, click reward, click big reward. That plays into how the brain works, because if you get the same exact thing for every effort you produce, it's like, oh, okay, that's the way it is, and you should just stay there. And then it's like, why should I put the extra effort in? Because the reward doesn't ever change. If you have these moments where you reward extra big, that's going to inspire them, hopefully, to put in more effort. Although, of course, over time there's going to be a click and no reward, but they'll understand that the click means they did the right thing, and they recognize that and think, oh, click means I'm awesome. And then on occasion, they also get a big reward. Karen Rolfe did a podcast with another trainer that talks about this type of method, and they describe it like you're standing at a door, and as everybody walks in, they give you $1 as they go in, and over time you realize that, hey, I only need $20 today to get what I want. And 20 people go by, you get what you want, so you check out, leave, and you no longer do the job even though the task isn't complete. You're no longer earning money, but you got what you wanted. But if instead you're standing at the door, you get $1, then someone gives you $5, it's like, oh, cool, I've got 5 times the amount for the same amount of effort, I might stick around. If 2 people don't give you any dollars, the next person might give you 10. You keep up your vigilance on the job because of that extra bonus reward, and the occasional moment where there isn't a physical reward don't matter as much because there is a potential for a bigger reward there as well. That all said, positive reinforcement works as well as your horse's mind keeps present. If you are in a super high stress situation, yes, it can work in high stress situations, but if you reach a point where your horse is no longer thinking, honestly, nothing is going to work. You can't pull on your reins hard enough, you can't shout loud enough for them to click back in if they have reached a point where they no longer feel that they are safe. Regardless of the style of training you're doing, your goal is to keep your horse in a thinking, productive state of mind that allows them to engage with you and stay with you mentally. A horse that is highly stressed may not accept treats anymore, and you need to do something that helps them re-engage into a state of mind where they're no longer thinking their personal safety is threatened. I personally find a combination of both positive and negative reinforcement works really well for most animals. Again, once you're in the vehicle, it becomes harder to click and treat because your animal's a lot further away. If I'm using positive reinforcement while long lining and such, I do want the animal to keep his nose forward. I'll actually work on a quote-unquote nose forward signal, and the reason for this is multiple. Having that nose turn around is a problem. One, your equipment should be set up that the horse isn't being poked in the neck, but if the head and neck are turning, the chance of the rest of the body flipping around is greatly increased, and then they're not standing still anymore. I don't want them reaching around and taking the treat because it interferes with the horse's ability to stand while driving. Riding? Great. You're sitting there, the horse is right there, they turn the neck around and you give them the treat. Ideally, you signal them which side the treat is coming from. I'll often be a contrarian here. If the horse is looking left, I'll tap them on the right side of the neck to give the treat on that side, so they aren't anticipating as much where the treat is coming from and to keep them even on both sides of the neck. A lot of times they'll bend to one side but not enough to the other side, and then things don't work as well because you have an uneven horse. But Back to the driving horse. With a driving horse, if I'm using positive reinforcement, whether in hand, lunging, or long lining, I'm not going to give them a treat if their neck is bent. I want them to be looking straight forward and waiting for me to deliver said reward rather than trying to hunt it down by turning their neck one way or another. That is an important note to me when using positive reinforcement for driving versus riding. Of course, you don't necessarily have to use treats. Scratches and rubs also work. Some actually prefer scratches and rubs over food rewards anyways. Typically, when you're driving, you can oftentimes reach the animal with the butt of your whip to give them a scratch or a rub that way, and it's a little more feasible than stepping out of the vehicle and going to the front to give them a food reward. If you have somebody with you, of course, you can have your groom go out and deliver the reward also. Over time, it does reach a point where the marker itself is the reward and the animal thinks, oh, cool, I did the right thing. I might get a treat, I might not, but I did the right thing, and I'm awesome. So I do want to make a final note on the negative reinforcement. While positive reinforcement uses what we term as an appetitive stimulus to get the desired response, negative reinforcement uses what is termed as an aversive stimulus to encourage the desired behavior. The pressure applied is something the horse wants to avoid, but that doesn't mean that it is painful or even uncomfortable. When we work with and train our animals, our goal should be to help them do the job the most comfortable and best way possible so that it is ultimately enjoyable for them. We redirect the body to move in a more productive manner, and it builds up their strength and balance over time. Because of this, the initially quote-unquote aversive stimulus and negative reinforcement can transform into something of an appetitive one. The animal seeks out the guidance and direction you have to offer because they have come to know that you are going to help them do the job better and to be more comfortable. Well, hopefully you all found this information about the 4 training quadrants useful and will be able to make use of it in your work with your animals. I personally use a mixture of both, which I think I've mentioned 3 or 4 times now, but I know accomplished trainers that use only negative reinforcement and others that use only positive reinforcement. What type of training we do depends on a multitude of factors, and the greatest of which is the individual animal and how it learns best. If you have any questions or comments, you can email them to easyintheharness@gmail.com, or through our Patreon, there is the ability to comment there as well. And have a good day.